Hello, everybody. I'm gonna drink. Laura's gonna talk.
Okay. Hello and welcome. We're going to talk about escape room game design. Let's see.
And other things escape related.
Yes. This is the Freeplay 2018 online sessions. Freeplay is Australia's largest and longest running independent games festival. The festival is currently running all week in Melbourne, Australia. Tickets to the weekend conference are still available, and you can find them at freeplay.net.au. If you'd like to join the conversation, the hashtag is #freeplay18.
Awesome. Thanks. So maybe we should start by introducing ourselves, yeah, and what we do.
Sure.
I think. How about you start? I think you've been doing escapes longer than I have.
Sure. My name is Laura E. Hall. I'm based in Portland, Oregon, where it is currently midnight. So I'm really excited to be joining everybody in Australia right now. I do make escape room games. I run a company here called the Meridian Adventure Company. We bring very highly narrative, interactive puzzle room games, as well as escape rooms to the public. But I got my start doing puzzle stuff from playing multi-user dungeons or MUDs online when I was in high school. And that led to spending a lot of time on the internet. And then I got into alternate reality games when I was in college. The first one that I ever encountered was called I Love Bees. Alternate reality games are these sort of online treasure hunts that are played out both online and in person. It's sometimes you're looking at the code of a website, sometimes you're meeting up with people. The thing that got me really hooked on that one was seeing at the time, there was this big list of coordinates and times, and each one led to a payphone. And on that time and date, it would ring, and Facebook didn't exist at that time. Payphones still did. So it was just really mind blowing that something shared through the internet could bring people together like that. So I got very into those alternate reality games, but for a long time, I still didn't really think of myself as a puzzle person, even though they're really based around puzzle solving. It wasn't until I moved here to Portland in the late double aughts and started participating in an event called Puzzled Pint, which is a monthly global puzzle solving event. If you look at puzzledpint.com, there's probably one somewhere near you. And if there isn't, you can host one. But that's like a team-based puzzle solving event. And that was when I finally admitted to myself that maybe this was my kind of thing. It was with that team of solving people that I played my first escape room. It was one of the first in the Pacific Northwest. And on the way back, we were like, well, we're all video game designers and theater people and people who like this kind of weird interactive stuff. So, it was kind of like, well, how hard could it be? Because we did not know any better. We ended up, it very hard, as it turns out. We opened our first room here in Portland in 2014. Since then, everybody else has moved away and moved on. So now I'm the sole owner of this company, and we are reopening our physical location later this year.
Super cool. I think I just learned a bunch of new stuff about you. That's exciting.
Yeah.
So for me, getting into puzzles definitely started with video games. When I was a really little kid, I had older cousins who were super big on like LucasArts point and click adventures and things like that. And I think that's how I first got swept up into that kind of out of the boxing mentality, I guess. And in Helsinki, we opened up. So, I just realized that I just went straight into talking about like me and escapes. My name is Elie Abraham, and I live in Helsinki, Finland, where it's currently 9 a.m. So for me, that counts as having to wake up early to do a talk. And in 2015, the first ever escape came to Finland, which was wild. And I remember in the article where they were like, oh, this thing is coming they described it as like a real life video game, like this game you could be in or whatever. And I got the idea immediately because they were comparing it to the kinds of games I was used to growing up. And of course, and I'm sure we'll get into it later, video games are what paved the way for escape rooms to become what they are, because they started off as video games. But yeah, in 2015, a company called Inside Out opened up in Finland, and they opened up the first escape room in all of Finland. And that's the company that later hired me. Now there's like 20 escape companies in Helsinki alone, let alone the entire country. Like, escapes boomed really fast. Not just in Finland. They got really popular really quickly, kind of in lots of countries all over the world. But in Finland, it was like the past few years where that happened, and it happened quite quickly. And I ended up finding work with Inside Out, that one company I mentioned, that started escapes, I guess, in Finland. And when I joined, at first, it was mostly as a game runner. They were looking for the right personalities, because a lot of what Inside Out does is remain in character. And we receive our customers, like our customers would come in and I'd be like opening the door like, hey, are you the detectives? And then the group of people are like, we booked an escape room, and I'm there like, wink, wink, I get it, you're undercover, and that was like part of what we did. So they were always so interested in finding the right kinds of minds to be working with their vision of how they want to do escapes. And because I was already involved in in games at the time, I was mostly doing audio, but have since started doing writing and design as well. And so my boss asked me if I would be interested in designing an escape-like immersive experience, and it was supposed to be a 2-hour thing meant to take place in multiple locations with multiple live actors, intentionally aimed at, because we already had multiple escapes, and they're like, okay, what can we offer people when they're like, well, we want to bring our company and there's 40 of us, So yeah. Even if we were to divide them all and put them into separate rooms or whatever, it's a whole thing. And so my boss was like, what could we create for them? And I was hired to come up with this immersive escapes, immersive escape-like experience. And that was kind of how I got my start in design. I guess I should mention the biggest thing Inside Out did, which was kind of relatively recent, which is really cool. In December, we partnered with 20th Century Fox and the local Finnish railway company. And we made an escape. Again, this is like a live escape-like experience that was Murder on the Orient Express themed. And it took place on an actual moving train, and you had to apply to be a part of it, and then you would compete against another team that was trying to do the same puzzles, and there was like celebrity captains, and the whole thing was live streamed, and the train went from Helsinki all the way to Lapland, so that's like a 13-hour ride. And that was a pretty crazy experience, because to design something that has the limitations of working on public transportation, and it has to be that long, and it also has to be competitive to some degree, because there's two people trying to be the first to make it to the end. And so that was a pretty huge thing for us, and I guess maybe even the history of escape. I know the game, which is about escapes and other of games and puzzle games, and not what is, I guess, at this point considered more conventional, just like any video game. And so my boss and other people from the company were just the Murder on the Orient Express experience. But yeah, that's kind of, I guess that's the intro to us.
Yeah. Cool. So we've been just discussing the sorts of things that we would want to cover on this. And, the breadth of this industry is actually massive. It started with, as you pointed out, all of the point and click puzzle adventures online, and has continued now into real world spaces. And I think pushing that level of scale is sort of the next step. That's something that as a venue owner, we're finding a lot. The issues of scale and throughput, and especially replayability, are really large. Is that something that you also find?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so like I said, part of how I got into escapes was also just my own personal interest because of the video games that was. One of the themes is that like you can't, when you play them again, the challenge that the game is based around is essentially more. You already know the answers were already written there or something like that, you know? So replayability is definitely kind of the biggest issue, you could say, in escape games, because once you do them, you essentially there's, I mean, it's debatable in some ways, but for the most part, yes, that's kind of how it goes. And a lot of people are offering ideas for where they think escapes could develop on this front. And I know that we talked earlier, and I mentioned where they have Sleep No More, where you would enter a building and there's multiple levels and you have a certain amount of time to explore whatever you want to explore. Yeah, I see that in the back there. So for people who don't know, when you go to Sleep No More, they give you this particular mask, which you can see in the background right there, exactly. And you wear this mask and you enter, and then you get to go through this, it's like a modernized Shakespeare experience, essentially, right? Because I haven't actually done it, so maybe you would like to explain Sleep No More for a second, since you have.
Yes, I would love to. I've been 3 times and I would go again. The idea with Sleep No More is that it is taking place as a theater dance performance. It's largely wordless, over the course of an evening, and it's in a building that's 5 or 6 stories high. The entire building is the stage, so there's no on and off stage. There are parts that are limited access, or sometimes an actor will go through a door that closes behind them and you can't follow them, but in a general sense, every part of it is accessible to you. The show loops 3 times in an evening, and the entire audience is masked, as you can see, with these really creepy kind of plague doctor style masks. And it's the story of Macbeth, and it's sort of intertwined with some Daphne du Maurier stories like Rebecca. There's a whole subplot with the second Mrs. De Winter. But it's the sort of thing where a minor character who might, a maid who appears on stage, presents something and then leaves, now has their own entire storyline. So you follow them at will throughout the entire space, just according to your own whim.
So thank you, first of all, for explaining that further. And I was really inspired by that. And it's crazy that I haven't been to Sleep No More yet, because I keep hearing about it, especially as someone in my field, but I just don't live in America. So I remember last year playing Fulbright's Tacoma shortly after it came out. And I really liked the game. And around that time, when I was starting to move into doing more design for escapes and such, I was thinking, like, what could a game like this be like if it had married Sleep No More, essentially? And I was just thinking, because if you took Sleep No More and then just put in all these puzzles and challenges and perhaps more dialogue and scripted sequences that weren't more, because you said it's mostly wordless. So if there was more dialogue and there was more like puzzles, like you said, a lot of doors close behind you and you can't follow through. But what if that was the challenge? You have to figure out, how do you get through that door? Or do I choose a different storyline and go elsewhere? I was thinking, like, what an incredible escape experience that would be. We have this group in Finland called, I think they're called After Dark, and normally they run a show in a Sleep No More-esque type way, I think for a week or maybe just a weekend, like once a year. And every year the location changes and it's a completely new show. And someone told me how he went, and to get access to a particular place, they needed to distract one of the actors. And that because the actor was literally there to be like, I'm sorry, you can't go to this, you know, you can't go back there or whatever. And so part of the game was for them to be like, oh, well, could you help us with this thing? You know, and kind of like winking at someone else to like go to the back or whatever. And I was like, and they were telling me how much fun that was for them. And I was thinking, like,
Cool.
wow, yeah, I know, because suddenly the puzzle involves interacting with people, you know,
Right.
and not even just like interviewing them to try to like, you know, murder mystery style figure out who's at the bottom of it, but for you to literally like physically progress, for you to literally get to the next room, you have to do something with this person. And I was imagining to myself, like, what if I just happened to witness someone steal something in the control room of the spaceship, and if I wanted, I could choose to follow them to see where they were going. And then, but the other people I was with were like, well, I want to see what the captain was about to say or whatever, and they wanted to stay in the room or go to another one or whatever. And then imagine somewhere it's scripted that halfway through the experience, there's a huge explosion. So no matter where on the ship you are, you hear this loud bang and everyone's like, oh, what was that? You know? And suddenly you're brought back together, you're all in the control room, and it's like, oh, what's going on? What's the deal? And I was just thinking, like, imagine getting to the end of that experience and then telling your friends, like, well, you know what I saw, you know,
Right.
or like, you know what you could find if you go over here or you go over there, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking that would give you so much incentive. I mean, you were saying you went to Sleep No More 3 times and you'd go again. And it sounds like the kind of experience that would encourage that, which is super fascinating to me. And I'd love to design escapes in a similar way, where there's so many elements that are immersive and they encourage you to come back and to have tried a whole series of puzzles that weren't even available to you.
Yeah, I think that escape rooms sit in the middle of a scale where on one side you have like really deep immersive things, including LARP. There's also a theatrical interactive immersive performance piece called The Headlands Gamble that runs in San Francisco. That's by Gabe Smedresden and Catherine Herdlick, who also run the Adventure Design Group down there. But they have a lot of like in-person interactions that are necessary for you to progress through. Then I think in the middle you have like the highly structured puzzle games. And someone on Twitter has just pointed out also that, you know, there are a lot of TV show escape rooms from the 80s and like things like the Crystal Maze, for example.
Right.
I think that there's just, you know, people naturally enjoy puzzle solving. I've heard it described as willingly placing yourself into a situation where you're in pain, because you then are given the power to release yourselves from that pain. So, you know, I think just that's something people have been drawn to treasure hunts and mysteries of all kinds for as long as people have been around. And then
Do you
I think,
remember Legend of the Hidden Temple?
oh yes, definitely.
It's almost, yeah, they have that sequence at the end where the kid gets to run through the temple or whatever, and that's like as escape roomy as it gets.
Yeah, the Shrine of the Silver Monkey. They never were able to assemble it. And then I think on the other end of it, you're getting these sort of new experiences, which are more, they're less even about the interactions. They don't necessarily embrace one thing over another. Things like Meow Wolf, the massive art installation in Santa Fe, New Mexico. That's like in a former bowling alley. I think it's 20 or 30,000 square feet. That one is sort of, there's like a cohesive story sort of that binds the space together, but each of the individual spaces are also designed by different artists. So it's theme park-like, sort of. It's not as like Disney polished as that.
Right.
But that is, you know, there are interactions. If you're looking for a story, there sort of is one that you can follow, but that's not really the point. And I've seen, you know, we've visited and people interact with that space differently because they're not just there to rip through everything and solve a puzzle. Sometimes people just go there to sit and watch what's going on. You know, I saw a lot of grandparents with children and the children are just running amok while the grandparents are just kind of hanging out. You could just go there to listen to music. It's really a pretty extraordinary space. But to see the sheer scale of that and the number of people moving through that was really exciting to me. Just, it's very different from what we're doing, even though it's very much in the same family.
Super cool. There's two things. You said something that made me think of a couple things. What you were saying, how like it's not necessarily the story isn't necessarily the point or whatever, and that's something I feel in a lot of escape rooms. I do that the story isn't exactly the point. It's there to like provide the theme of the props around you, et cetera, et cetera. But really, you can almost oftentimes ignore the story. I mean, it depends on how the escape is designed, but it feels that way oftentimes for me. And that also, you also mentioned briefly LARPs earlier, and that reminded me that I wanted to mention that one of the main reasons I got into puzzle design for escapes wasn't just because I was a big point and click fan, but because when I first started being a game master in my early 20s or whatever, I, for the first time, just started designing puzzles that were meant for other people to actually solve or whatever. And it's important to realize how similar making puzzles can be in that way, and to not discredit ourselves for our credit. I mean, discredit ourselves for our experience with working with puzzles. I mean, you yourself were saying that you were like, playing with ARGs and stuff like that, but you didn't even realize that you actually were like a puzzly person or whatever. And it's important to remember how those things are related and how similar they can be to each other. Obviously, also different, which is part of why we're talking about this.
Right.
And that kind of that might be a great way to segue into the elements that actually make up an escape. Because for me, I've found that when you design, at least for me, one of the most important tools is the story, regardless of important the story actually is to the player's experience. Because if you have the story, it's like this guideline for how to progress in the actual design process. And what I mean by that is, if I go to someone and I'm like, hey, could you give me a puzzle right now? And it's like, like, where do you start even? Right. But if I say like, hey, you're about to break into this research lab to steal the vaccination for blah, 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 and you're in an office right outside of the lab and the door is locked, what should the first puzzle be? You suddenly have this whole framework for like where you might want to start and what might come next. Well, like if I was in a situation like this, so instead of just designing a puzzle and then being, okay, how can I make this lead into the next puzzle or whatever, when you have a story, it kind of like holds your hand and makes it a lot easier for you to figure out how one might actually want to go about doing all of those things. So for me, I always say, like, when you're designing a puzzle, an escape room, start with the story. As in, what is even just knowing loosely what the story is or what the theme is will make it so much easier for you to design puzzles, especially because your puzzles, many of them should be thematic.
I totally agree.
Yeah, right. I think so. I'd really like to talk about like the different kinds of puzzles. Should we take our conversation there now?
Yeah, sure. I will also add that my own personal work is extremely like highly narrative, just because that's what I'm the most interested in playing with.
Me too.
Obviously, the games don't even necessarily need that, because when you're in that space with your friends, you're having fun basically no matter what. Even if the room is bad, even if there's no story to speak of, just the mere fact of being there in that place with real people is almost enough to always overcome that. The most advanced and probably fun game that I've ever played was earlier this year in San Francisco. It's a very, very technologically advanced game, so much that it's basically like being in a video game. There's maybe like a sprinkling of a story that is quickly ignored. I mean, it's thematic, right? But the amount of technology as it is related to the historical figure does not make like narrative sense, but it's probably the best game I've ever played, right? So kind of, does it actually matter? That's a question that I find myself asking a lot, since that's like the complete focus of my work. The narrative is also where I begin with everything. For me, there's a lot of world building that goes into it, because all of the story that I understand gets built into the room, gets built into the environment, gets built into the puzzle objects in a way that it's conveying all of this story for people who have entered a limited cognitive state, right? Like, it's something that I talk about a lot. When you step across the threshold into this other world, you know, you have this kind of fight or flight response. It's a survival instinct. The room is dark. You don't know what is in there. Like there's this timer, and your focus basically narrows instantaneously. And it's really difficult to convey anything, for example, in writing that somebody is supposed to remember. It's impossible to convey something in audio that somebody is supposed to remember because brains just naturally tune that out. So you have to look for other ways to tell the story. And that can be in the environmental theming, which I tend to pull a lot from film design and sort of cultural archetypes that are familiar. They take on a lot of the burden of that narrative shorthand. You know, our first game that we made was dystopian, sort of like East Germany behind the Berlin Wall, propaganda office. And the look of that, everybody recognizes because movies have covered it forever. So by utilizing that and using the same lighting style and the same colors, it was really easy to evoke that instantly. You don't have to have a really complicated backstory that people are bombarded with that they're never going to pay attention to because they already.
In fact, sometimes, exactly, sometimes it's actually easier to borrow from a narrative that you know people are already familiar with because they can fill in the gaps themselves without having to do much work on that end and focus on the things, for example, in this case, like on the actual puzzles. I remember doing a workshop on telling stories through exclusively through audio without any dialogue or whatever. And it had to be like a minute long. And what I did was essentially, I told the story of someone at a party who then realized it was a full moon and they were going to turn into a werewolf. But I just realized this is the kind of thing, people have seen before, you know, in movies or shows or read in books or whatever. Like the idea of someone suddenly being like, oh no, it's my night, and their clothes tear off and they run off into like that's something they've heard of before. So I thought to myself, if there's just like a few loose threads and then a howling at the end, people will know what will happen. People aren't going to be like, what was that animal? What was going on? And so that's also why some escapes will end up borrowing, well, I guess my company even did it. You know, we just took the story of a film that already existed. That's why we have like Star Wars themed or Pirates of the Caribbean themed, you know, escapes or whatever. Everybody already knows like what the deal is. And so that's already kind of filled in their head.
Right. Yeah, it makes it a lot easier. The other thing that I like to focus on is the sort of diegesis of objects. I've been to plenty of escape rooms that just have random stuff in there. I am very careful, and this is basically just a sign from like my background as an alternate reality games player. In that community, if there is a detail to find, people will find it and then they will study it for hours and make a meaning emerge from it, even if originally it didn't have any meaning. So like from the story making side, you can really utilize that because people are just filling in the blanks themselves. But it also has taught me to not put in extraneous detail if I don't want somebody to obsessively focus on that. I mean, I know that's like a basic design principle for any kind of game, but especially if you're telling people, pay attention to every single thing, then you put that in there, you'd better actually mean it.
I saw an interview with Tim Schafer where he was talking about the design of their game Day of the Tentacle, and he showed there was a very specific scene where he said, you see all these objects over here that are kind of in the front and how we've intentionally shaded them such to show you that they're irrelevant. Like there's tons of stuff in the scene, but it's like all these things are shaded such that you know already they're not important, so you don't mess around with them.
Right.
And in
a real world space.
That's exactly what I was about. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. That the funny thing about in video game design, you spend some time teaching players the rules of the world. But in an escape, they already know the rules of the world because we live in it, you know. And you're dealing with everything that is actually real. So it's not like, oh, if I press A, I can do this, or you know, I can blah blah blah. You know, they walk into an escape room. Your players already know they can't wall jump, you know, like just or whatever.
Totally. I also think that applies to strong puzzle design as well, right? The most elegantly designed things, you might not know immediately how to solve it, but you know what you should be doing in order to solve it. An example that I like to use is one from that first escape room from 2014. It's a set of library books. Along the spine it has little library stickers that are the Dewey Decimal System, and inside they all have pockets, and one of those pockets has a library card. If you know how to use a library, it makes sense that you would order them by the spines. That would give you a sentence, tells you which page to look on, and then you could overlay that library card onto that page to get the next piece out. But increasingly, people do not know how to use that library system because everything is digital now. People are also not able to use typewriters, VHS tapes, cassette tapes, things like that. So it's making it more difficult to design a puzzle that is intuitive because people are not naturally able to interact with that anymore. People are aging out of it.
Actually, that reminds me of a puzzle in an escape room Inside Out used to have, where you had to there are a bunch of scented bottles and people have to smell them and then, get the right letters from the letters in the bottles, put them into a letter lock, and that's how they open something up. And I was like, wow, you'd be surprised how many people don't actually know what, I don't know, lavender smells like or whatever. And so we kind of do a lot of assuming of what our players might know, and in an escape, that's actually quite tough. I mean, especially because like if you're playing a video game, you can ask a friend, you can Google it, you could do whatever that will help you get through that point. But in that moment where there's like a time pressure and your resources are you and your idiot boyfriend that you brought with you and his best friend or whatever, like it's a lot harder.
Right. And it's limited resources cognitively. It's limited resources physically. There's a game that I played at a festival a few years ago, 2 Rooms and a Boom, that Doug Wilson introduced me to. And we accidentally ended up playing for hours and hours and hours.
Did you say 2 Rooms and a Boom?
Yes.
I love that game.
Right? A physical card game you're running around
yes.
in teams.
Yeah.
And at the end of it, I was like, why do my legs hurt so badly? Because you're so swept up in that fun, you don't realize that time is passing, right? It's the same thing in escape rooms. It happens all the time. People forget that they're tired. They don't notice things that are happening in their own body over the course of that hour. When the timer stops, suddenly the real world comes rushing back in. But until that is happening, like everything just falls to the side. So, I mean, it means that there's a lot of ethical responsibility as a designer for people that are in that space. It's something that I think applies to VR too, where people don't have external cues like sunlight or a timer or their friends being like, oh, I'm tired. There is a field of that I think is being totally ignored because you want people to keep playing your stuff. So.
Absolutely. One thing, so I'm going to intentionally rush into something else, and also maybe we shouldn't spend too much time on it because we don't have too much time, but we've been giving examples of different kinds of puzzles we'll see in a room or whatever. It reminds me sometimes actually years ago when I was talking to a friend of mine who's like, listen, if you're playing a game that has combat or whatever, one of the most important ways to keep this fresh is enemy variation. And I think that stands usually in puzzles, in escapes and the kinds of puzzles there are. Like I would be, unless I went in knowing and I had chosen to have that experience, I'd be disappointed to go into an escape room that just had a series of math problems, essentially. And people, I think it might not seem as obvious until you start actually getting into this kind of work, but there's so many different kinds of puzzles, and keeping the types of puzzles varied is part of what keeps the escape very interesting. There's nothing that drives me more than like a lock that leads, a key that leads to a lock that leads to a key that leads to a lock, and so on and so forth. I would hate to find a key that opens a box that has a key that opens another box, that has a key that opens another box, has a key that opens another box, and I've had that experience. It's very frustrating. But you and I were talking about like, oh, you see these books and then you order them in the right way. Or I mentioned, scent puzzles or whatever. And so people who are watching this who might be interested in actually doing some design themselves, because I was saying when I first started designing puzzles, I was just a game master, doing it for my friends or whatever. So who knows how people are going to take this information and use it. But if you're interested in trying to design escapes, for me, like when I'm also, you mentioned that there was this like very tech heavy room in San Francisco. And that's another thing, is that some people feel like escapes should be tech heavy, which I don't agree with because I don't think the technology is what makes the room. But it's usually cool when there's at least one like technologically neat thing, or like one wow factor technologically neat puzzle to your room. And it doesn't actually even technologically have to be complex. It just has to be like, oh, that's unusual. This doesn't happen in my real life. I don't normally press a button and then a ball drops from the ceiling or whatever. But it's important to remember that, like, if you want players to think outside of the box, you know, that having a math problem after a math problem after a math problem will get boring very, very quickly. I think math problems are good, but also that the math itself should never be complicated. It's always about figuring out the logic behind the math puzzle, you know? And I like math problems, but if I'm in an escape that has a difficult math problem, I think this is not how this should be done, you know?
Right.
But aside from that, you like a lot of players, they like to find stuff. They like to find a key somewhere, and that's cool. And people want to use their senses. So I mentioned we had like a scent puzzle. We had an escape where you had to literally put your hand in a dark hole, which is terrifying already on its own. And then you had to feel around, and you realize we had some numbers on the wall, but they were all made out of different materials, and these things were all interwoven into the puzzle. Sometimes it's just a matter of realizing, like, hey, did you notice that all those things are colored in a certain way and there's different numbers of fruits in the paintings or whatever, you know, all these kinds of things. But the point is that if you want to start designing escapes, you know, because we started saying like, oh yeah, remember the story. The story is going to help you guide you through this whole thing. But then once you're doing that, don't just think like, well, if the world was like this, where would the keys be hidden, or you know, or whatever, or what kind of math puzzle should they find in the documents? Because really, you want to keep that stuff varied to make an interesting escape.
Right, and I would say things that we tend to design for a variety of different types, because you're going to get groups that come in with different skill sets, and you want there to be a balance, you know, some visual, some detail oriented, whatever the case is. We try and have paths where people are sort of scattershot, then there are tracks that they're going down, then they come together for a story moment, then they spread back out again, things like that. We like to have hero moments where somebody finds the key on the other side and it's this triumphant thing of like, this is the thing, and it goes over there, and I've made that connection. And I would say the easiest way by far to do this, to figure out what is actually working, is nonstop playtesting, because you can playtest for months. You get into the room with the actual objects, and then people will shock, frighten, and surprise you with how many things that they can break in very creative but interesting and educational ways.
Yes.
And you really do learn a lot just from watching people try to solve something. It's actually a really important skill to develop, because when people are failing to solve a puzzle that you have designed, it is never their fault. It is your fault for not making the design good enough. You know, puzzle difficulty is adjustable based on how much or how little information you've given them. So that's where most escape rooms rely on hint systems in order to direct people's attention differently. But to be able to restrain yourself from jumping in and saying, hey, here's how to do it, you know, let me just finish that for you, takes away from that little feeling of victory that people are getting. When I've done game moderation, you know, I see somebody struggling with something, and I'll look at my watch and I'll wait like a minute or a minute and a half before I start to nudge them. And almost every single time they get there themselves without my intervention. And so just playtesting is by far the most educational thing that you can do for yourself as a designer.
Even as a game master, I realized that, like, I design all these puzzles, and things that I thought were super simple were very challenging, and things I thought were very challenging, they completely figured out, or the ways in which they figured the puzzle out was way different than what I had anticipated.
Yeah.
You know, it's hard to know what other people are going to try, and you should be available. You should be flexible, such that what you've designed will either not be broken by them playing around, or will cater to the fact that they might try it in a different way.
Right. I'll give an example of a scent-based puzzle that I did as part of a puzzle hunt by mail. It was a scratch and sniff card. And it turned out that actually distinguishing scents without any context whatsoever was basically impossible. We ended up having to reference the manufacturer's website to find out what scents were available for printing on cards. just in order to narrow it down at all. So I just learning the hard way about what not to place in my own things.
Since we're getting kind of towards the end of the time we have, is there maybe something that you would like to go out on before we take some questions?
Yes, I'd love.
Because there's so many great things we could discuss, but this is the time we
could go forever. There's actually two
Yeah.
things that I would like to mention.
Yes.
The first is that when you are doing this right, the work that you have put into it should be completely invisible, unless that's sort of the artistic point, is to make people aware of the creator's hand behind it. But it's the paradox of the magician. You're doing impossible things. You're tricking people in order to usher them through this narrative or story world or experience of feelings or whatever it is. And there should never be any kind of friction that is taking them out of that experience. Because then it's not working, right? It's the technology that's sufficiently advanced that it seems like magic. It makes it look easy, and that is because it's working correctly. And it's actually very, very difficult to achieve that. One of the things that I think is the most friction giving is usually accessibility related stuff. It's something that I think of a lot in design. I don't make people crawl. There's different heights for things that are appropriate. A lot of puzzles do require a particular level of dexterity, but that is also still like a point for which people sometimes can't interact with. Audio-based things without subtitles, color blindness is something that comes up all the time. So that's just one of those invisible things that, as a designer, like, you really have to pay attention to, because for that one person who's affected by it, it's taking them out of this experience that you're trying to gift to them. And that's something that's really important to me.
That's actually something I pointed out to people as well. I was like, listen, it's not going to happen that you get a group of people where all of them are colorblind in the exact same way, but I don't think that matters. Like, it shouldn't just be about the fact, like, well, someone in the group can do it, It's really important that those puzzles feel accessible to everyone. And sometimes you get really cool ideas that, like you said, might require someone to, crawl through something or whatever. But accessibility is also extremely important to me too. And it can be tough because sometimes you have to kill your darlings to make something more accessible, but that is really important in society, and that should be reflected in our design.
Yeah. How about you?
Yeah, in fact,
final thoughts?
Actually, yeah, this would have transitioned great into one of the topics I really wish we could have had more time to talk about. So accessibility is something that can even be discussed in the room itself, Like, it doesn't have to just be a thing where it's like, oh yeah, we made this really accessible for everyone. It could be a thing that's even discussed. And what I mean by that is that, I mentioned that it would have been cool to go into the idea of where can escapes, some people have said, like, can escapes be educational? Like, they've asked, can escapes be educational? Can they have a social impact or whatever? And it makes me think a little bit even about how video games developed, where obviously we remember Super Mario and Space Invaders and, the original Donkey Kong or whatever. And those games aren't known for, like, the social justice message or whatever, etc. But we're at a point now that game industry is so big and indie is so popular that people have started to use games to express various ideas that are very personal or very or ideas that they're trying to spread or whatever through the means of this interactive experience in a way that is teaching or sharing an idea that they'd like to be influential and not just to make a game that's entertaining. And I think that as escapes are growing, we can realize that there's room for that in escapes as well, especially if we're starting to talk about, like, immersive theater performances or whatever. I mean, imagine when we were talking about Sleep No More, or I said I was thinking about Tacoma, and imagine what would this game be like in its escape? What if, we were just talking about the concept of accessibility. What if there was a character that needed things to be designed in an accessible way, and there was intentionally an inaccessible part of the room or the theater performance or whatever, and then that character was planted there to show how that is problematic or whatever, I think there's so much room to explore ideas like that in games. And part of what came to mind is that I've seeing things go socially wrong in escapes. I've seen people who make comments where it's like, whoa, dude, like you can't say that just because she's a woman, for example, you know, something like that. And it's just like there might actually be room in our immersive game experiences to discuss sexism or whatever, because I've seen things like that, you know, happen. And it's really hard because then you're starting to think like, oh, do I have to step in here? Should I say something here? And is this even the context in which I can do it? And are they going to be receptive to it? But if that's in the design of the experience,
right,
then maybe, yeah.
yeah. I mean, the themes that you do see that are very common usually revolve around violence of some kind. There's a lot of serial killer and zombie stuff, but there's also some kinds of cultural violence that pop up. Egyptian themes, I think, are naturally very popular because they lend themselves well to this sort of treasure hunting sense of adventure. But nobody discusses the very clear colonial aspect of, you know, raiding tombs and removing artifacts from different countries, and the fact that mummies are human bodies. That's just something that is never examined. So those are things that we put within our own work, because that is also really important to me to make nonviolent games, things that are expressions of nonviolence that show you that you can have adventures without guns and corpses.
Yes, absolutely. Relevant to what you just said, it's amazing to me how Prison Break is one of the most common, you know, escape themes, but prisons themselves are extremely problematic.
Right.
And it's like, hey, do you want to be the people who actually have to live this, and then you have to break out and you get an hour to do it, you know?
Yeah, you get to go home at the end.
Exactly. You're kind of gamifying something that's actually extremely problematic in society.
Yeah.
Anyway, I wish we could talk more about it, but I guess we can't. Is this the point where we're supposed to open this up for a Q&A? Is that how this goes?
Yeah.
Where do the questions come again?
We can pick them from Twitter, from the YouTube chat, or they can feed them to us.
Right. So, hey, people, oh goodness, there's probably tons of...
If it's on Twitter, it needs to be under the hashtag Freeplay18.
Right.
I mentioned one that had come before from Rowan Crawford. We both said that the real world escape rooms come from video games, but I'd heard that video game escape rooms and real world escape rooms had evolved separately. There are TV shows from the 80s, for example.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like think games. If you tell me if you know better, if I recall correctly, like Escape the Room, you know, was a video game genre, and so that's why a lot of that. It's really cool because they're quite old too, you know, and then they started to make like Myst and stuff like that or whatever.
Oh.
So if you think about like Escape the Room games, like you realize that this genre of game has been around for actually a really long time. And if I recall properly, the first time it became a real life industry was actually in Japan.
Right.
A pretty long time ago, actually. So the fact that now it's becoming way more popular around Europe and the States or whatever is still a relatively recent thing. I mean, yeah.
Oh, the Crimson Room, which is the first sort of point and click format of like you're in a room, there's a key somewhere, and it's sort of these linear puzzle steps, was released in 2004. By someone named Takagi, I believe. And you're right. The first similar things where it was a physical room, people were placed in it. This exact same kind of model was also in Japan. And some of the first ones that came over from that model were into America were Scrap, who are in San Francisco. But there are things in the U.S., and that, you know, that's what I'm the most familiar with. There's this thing in Syracuse called Five Wits, which is a sort of like interactive, gamey, kind of guided puzzle room adventure thing. I mean, even when I was growing up, there were what I would now consider immersive experiences. In Dallas, Texas, where I'm from, there was this restaurant called the Magic Time Machine. Each of the little booths was like a different theme, and all the waiters dressed up like characters from fiction. Or there's, you know, medieval times, the sort of like knights jousting, feasting sort of thing. You know, those are things that I grew up with. There's a long history of, for example, what is called armchair treasure hunting. Those are books with puzzles in illustrations that led to a real life place where there was something buried. The first really famous one was called Masquerade. That led to a golden hair that had been buried in a hill. I just think that like this sort of stuff is universally appealing to people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the sense that the world beyond your mundane reality could contain secrets and magic, and those sorts of wonderful things, I think, is something that everybody wants.
I have a lot to say about that, but I think you did a good job, and then maybe we should move on to some of the questions, even though I wish we could comment more about it. Like, there's so much to say about all this stuff. This is super exciting. One question we have is, what's the frontier of your own design practice at the moment? That is, what are you yourself learning at the moment? That's actually a really great question. You can go first.
Right. Well, I mean, the thing that I'm the most excited about was what I had mentioned before, Meow Wolf in New Mexico. Just it's art that is extremely accessible for people because it's not. It's basically a theme park in a way, which is very mass entertainment kinds of stuff, but it is all of these like individual artistic expressions. It's all weird, surreal stuff, strange imagery, and people just cannot get enough of it. And I really believe that increasingly, as the world becomes more difficult to participate in and inhabit, the need for things that help us to escape from that shake us up out of our realities and that remind us that there are things that do sort of transcend this like everyday routine of laundry and dishes and work and commuting to work and then recovering from it. Anything that is going to shake people out of that, I think, is not just valuable but necessary. Whether that is in the form of a theme park that you're going to with your family, an escape room that you're going to with your friends, or something that you see on the street that like somebody has left there just to surprise you and sort of shake you out of your routine. So that's the kind of stuff that I think is really the most fascinating. And in my own personal work, my personal frontier is the sort of like deeply narrative stuff that tells you all of the story without actually like speaking it out loud.
Yes,
so, like,
absolutely.
All environmental, yeah, and
Show, not tell.
right, to integrate humor, like comedy is also something that's really like not present in a lot of stuff. Some people take a stab at it, but like also, a lot of my favorite TV shows, Westworld, for example, which really covers a lot of this stuff too. Like that's the future of all of our jobs, frankly.
I thought of Westworld at least a couple times this talk.
Yeah, like nobody seems to be having fun in what is ostensibly a theme park, right? Like that does not
totally.
make sense to me. So comedy.
We have this, so I'll share a story real quick and then we'll move on to the other questions because I actually would really like to answer these two that just came in. One was so in one of the escapes I mentioned earlier, the one that had the scent puzzles, it was like a freaky circus show themed, long story short. And there's a part where someone needs to get inside one of those like magician assistant boxes. Like, the ones where like the whole point is there's like multiple panels to the door and they close it and then they open it and oh, the person's not there anymore. Like that kind of stereotype from like magic shows. So what happens is someone has to get inside it. And if the players can't figure out, then I might hit them like when the great whatever his name was tries to do a box or whatever, and people would go inside, and what they don't realize is the door magnetically locks itself, except for the top part of the door. So then when people try to get out of it, there's this moment where they realize that they're stuck, and 9 out of 10 times everybody starts laughing. Like everyone, like that moment of like genuine, like slight panic of like, whoa, I'm actually stuck in this box or whatever. People always laugh about like that funny situation. Like, I guess this is your life now,
Yeah, I live here now.
Yeah, exactly. So it's funny, like, because that's not even a story. Like, that's not even a story thing. That was just, I don't even know if that was intentional since I wasn't a part of the design of that particular one. But it's funny how that ended up being a funny thing, but also intentionally funny rooms. I don't know many I don't know if I know any. Yeah, really. And there's so much room for that. And I'm a stand-up comedian. It's one of the things I do, and that has started to intersect more and more with games. So I would love to write a funny room. Let's move on to the other questions because we only have a few minutes. With these next two, I actually want to combine the answer a bit. So the first question was, is there any theme or style of escape room that you haven't been able to do due to commercial success concerns that you'd love to do? And the one afterwards, is there a way to foster an indie escape room game sector alongside the regular commercially focused games? And I'd say the two actually go hand in hand. So I was thinking, like, how come there isn't more like DIY escape rooms? And in talking to people about it, I realized there's actually more of a DIY escape room scene than I originally realized. And part of how I even got the idea is me and a friend were like, wouldn't it be fun to just like throw a party that was actually like an escape room for our friends? It's like the theme would be like, you went to this really lame party and now you got to escape, you know? And we just like did it. So one of the ways, quickly to say, one of the ways to do more DIY rooms or to make things more indie or whatever is to make escape rooms that are easy to like set up and tear down pretty much anywhere. Like escape rooms in a box where you could show up to someone's home and then set things up around the room and essentially turn it into the escape room. And that's a really easy way to make it more indie or DIY. And there are people who are actually doing that. And this is a way to make event-based escape rooms where it's like, we can bring this escape to your event or whatever. I've seen music festivals, for example, do this. Now, in terms of like commercial success, I don't know how much I personally actually care about this sort of thing, but if you want to run a business, you have to. But as a queer person and someone who's interested in making games that would have like a social impact, I'd love to do an escape that discusses the concept of like, you know, queer culture as it stands in society or whatever. And that would also be a really great opportunity to make a funny room, because that topic can inherently be very much not funny, but if you make it something that feels like relatable and like hilarious, then suddenly it feels more accessible.
Right.
I will stop myself there to give you room in the few minutes that we have left.
Sure. I just wanted to shout out the people whose questions we have been reading. It was Maggie Pepelanova, Tooth Soup on Twitter, and Matt Lee from YouTube. I'd say, yeah, like I actually think of the escape room community as being largely DIY, even the ones that are now very commercially successful. A lot of people come into it because they build haunted houses. There's a huge like
totally
natural next step, and all of that is usually DIY stuff. I mean, now in the meantime, there have been like other companies that have emerged, but like largely that's where the roots have been. Themes and styles of escape rooms we haven't been able to do due to commercial success concerns. I'd also add, rent is so expensive that in order to do the sorts of experiences that I want to do on the scale, we've had to make it a commercial venture. That's just sort of necessary. But
my dream would be the Tacoma thing I described, you know, but that would be, I'd need a whole spaceship. Like,
well, somebody did do a thing called The Nest that ran in Los Angeles that was very similar to a real life version of Gone Home. But yeah, I was just going to say, like, the themes of the things that I'm making are basically just to amuse myself, and I hope other people are interested in them. One of them is sort of archaeology on Mars. That's actually my way of sidestepping having something that's Egyptian culture based. We're making an alien culture. We're inventing a language for it, but it's going to be, you know, landing on a planet, exploring an alien tomb, this sort of like 80s like vibe of, you know, sort of alternate spaceship stuff. And then the other one is going to be a teen girl's bedroom who was obsessed with a cartoon from like the 90s with a really great theme song. And eventually we'll step through the back of the wardrobe into the world of that cartoon, crystal forests and things. Those are basically literally just because like I want to be in those environments and I want to be in those stories. So that's kind of the place that I'm at right now. It's just like, definitely people will be into that because, you know, people are interested in that sort of thing, but it's for my own pleasure at this point.
And you said that you wanted to be in those environments. I'd say for me, that's one of the coolest things about an escape is like, you just get to be there. And that's why I love making rooms where like you walk in and it's already kind of like, wow, you know, like I feel like I'm in this thing or whatever.
Yeah.
I guess that's kind of all the time we have.
I think so.
So,
What are your websites and Twitter accounts and so on?
oh yeah, totally. My own website is www.elie, ellieabraham.com, and you can find me on Twitter at ellieabraham64. So those would be the easiest ways to find me.
Yeah, mine is Laura E. Hall, LauraEHall.com, and also the same name on Twitter.
Yeah, so thank you everybody for watching. Thank you Freeplay for having us. Thank you Laura for being my co-host here. Like it was super fun to talk about this, and I guess we should keep doing it off the camera. So
definitely. Thank you everybody.
Yeah, I guess this is so. Yeah, you're gonna go to sleep now. So good night, and I'm gonna go have breakfast, and I'm actually in Sweden right now for another games conference. So busy. All right, but yeah. So thank you, everybody. Oh, are we supposed to say what the next stream is?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I just saw that message come in.
Hey everybody, the next stream starts at 9 p.m. It's about DIY controllers. That's 9 p.m. Australian time.
Yeah, super cool. All right, thanks again, everybody.
Good night, good morning.
Kisses to everyone.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, exactly. Take care. Thanks for having us. Bye.